All right, thanks for hanging in there. We're almost done. We have one last model to talk about, and then I'm going to kind of wrap this whole thing up. The fourth model we're going to look at is called the critical model of communication, and it's pretty similar to the social constructionist model. It's at that big kind of society-wide, culture-wide level of analysis. And it's going to really pick up right where the social constructionist theory left off. It's going to say, yes, groups of people build different shared representations of reality that they use to understand the world. But it's going to insist that this process of building constructs is also a process by which people exercise power over one another, where one group exercises power over other groups. And it's going to really call into question the role of power in how we've constructed our society and our meanings. And so the critical model then sees communication as kind of the exercise of power. It's how people, through discursive acts, what we might call texts or cultural productions, kind of acts of communication, things like a novel or a TV show or a play or a song or a textbook or a scientific paper. These are called discursive acts, and it's going to say that these discursive acts will exercise power by either reinforcing the way things currently are, the way we divide up our wealth and power in society, or they're going to try to resist the status quo, resist the way things are, and try to challenge how we are distributing power within society. And so the critical model is going to be really concerned with the ways in which oppressive relationships between people get constructed using communication over time. The critical model then is going to view society as the product of a communicative contest, right? Different groups of people sending out different messages, expressing meaning through various texts, things like rituals and performances and books and TV shows and on and on and on, anything that can express meaning. Different groups of people produce these texts in order to make their values be the values that are accepted by society, to make the world that they want to live in the one that we're actually living in. And so there's a contest over meaning that is occurring, a kind of economy of power and an economy of meaning that's going on in society. And that activity is what we'd call communication from this point of view. It might help to get a better visual model of how this might look. And so here is a critical model of communication. It's a little complex, so bear with me. Basically, this is saying that a human society exists as kind of two different parts, in two different parts. There's the superstructure of society, right? And when we're talking about the superstructure of society, we're talking about the meaning of the things in society, right? It's the ideas of a society. It's the discourse and discussion of that society. It's what things mean, okay? And then there's the stuff of society on the bottom, the base, the material, right? All the things that are needed to produce things, people, raw materials, factories. And if we think about this as like kind of the activity of a TV station, right? A TV station is going to be made up of machines and people, and those machines and people are going to produce certain ideas, certain messages. They're going to produce perhaps a news broadcast and television sitcoms. And it is through those news broadcasts and television sitcoms that the superstructure kind of takes hold, right? Where we come to understand the meaning of life, right? It's through the sitcoms that we see, how a family behaves. And it's through the news broadcast that we express what things are important to us and what things we need to be worried about and what things we need to celebrate in our society. So the kind of raw material of the base is used to produce certain messages that create a sense of who we are. And then that sense of who we are is going to then have an effect on the material reality and how we share resources, who we celebrate, who gets paid more, who gets paid less, right? How we distribute wealth. And so we can use cultural productions to kind of maintain the status quo, and we can maintain the superstructure and kind of the current meanings that exist, or we can use the base to produce messages and discursive texts that will challenge and change the superstructure. Okay, so we're seeing communication as this activity of kind of creating material texts that change the meaning of the world affecting which texts get created in a kind of cyclical, either reinforcing or resisting fashion. To go further, the critical perspective can help us look at how we produce media, discursive texts, and how those media have hidden messages within them that can affect how we see ourselves, how we see each other, how we see the world. A good example of this would be like Disney movies. We show Disney movies to little kids, and something like Cinderella is going to have kind of hidden messages in it that express certain gender roles and expectations of how little girls should act and how little boys should act and how men and how women should act. And those hidden messages of gender are embedded within those Disney movies, but they're going to celebrate certain ways of being a man, certain ways of looking like a man, and certain behaviors. And it's going to celebrate certain ways of being a woman and certain behaviors, maybe passivity for the women and maybe heroism for the men. And it's going to try to perpetuate that sense of what it means to be a man in a society. And that can affect how little kids treat each other, how we treat each other. And it can affect how power is distributed in society. Why, maybe this could help us explain why there are more male CEOs, men CEOs, than women CEOs in our culture. An example of the kind of question you might ask if you were a critical scholar of communication, you're going to look at some sort of text of communication. There was a show on television when I was in high school called My So-Called Life, and it had Claire Danes in it as a young woman, and it showed her kind of expressing her sexuality and her creativity and her individuality in a way that really challenged the idea of femininity at the time, at least. And so I might ask, how does this text represent young women, right, as empowered, while also centering the experiences of white people? If you watch My So-Called Life, there aren't that many people of color in it, and they play minor roles. So they're kind of not really a big part of this narrative. And so it centers whiteness and white people. So a discursive text can kind of celebrate certain ways of being and diminish other ways of being, and a critical scholar would try to explain how the text does that in order to make life better for young women and make life better for people of color who might have been left out of this narrative. So there are many criticisms of the, it says cultural studies here. It should say critical perspective. There are many criticisms of the critical perspective. And the first is that it's just too new. It really didn't get started in the United States till about the 1960s with the civil rights movement and second wave feminism. And so it's relatively new. It's less than 100 years old in practice. So some people just criticize it for that. It's also very scattered around and tends to look at certain particular groups of people separate from one another. So you'll have critical race theories, you'll have critical gender theories, critical sexuality, class, ability. And so it's not necessarily very unified. It kind of has its different focuses, so it gets criticized for that. And then mostly what it gets criticized for is that for being an academic study, it's just too political. It's too activist. It's trying to actively change the world. It views communication as occurring on an unequal playing field, and it's trying to create a more equal playing field in the future, a more equal and equitable society. So it's activistic. It's not just trying to describe culture for how it is. It's trying to change that culture actively, and some people criticize it for that. So that concludes our look at the critical model of communication. Again, I know this says cultural studies here. That's a typo. I don't want to re-record this video after these several minutes. So critical model. To summarize all of these videos as quickly as I can, I'm hoping that you have a much better sense now about the varied ways we could answer the question, what is communication? Communication can be defined and looked at in many, many different ways. For our purposes in this class, we're going to use a working definition of communication as the process of using symbols to exchange meaning. And we're going to remember those different ways of looking at communication, our different models. We could look at communication as minds sharing messages and meanings as a kind of psychological model, as groups of people making sense out of the world through constructs that they build and share, the social constructionist model. We can look at it as people interacting and coordinating and cooperating through their patterns of action, like the pragmatic model. And finally, we can think of and remember communication as groups of people using power to either maintain society or to change or alter society. Thanks for your attention.